Good evening, everyone, and happy Sabbath. Health and Liberty Canada welcomes you to part 2 of our vaccine series. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements to make. First of all, we invite you to save the date for part 3 of this discussion on November. Well, I guess next Sabbath will be part 3 with Dr. Timothy Pernick. He will be contrasting Israel's healthcare system with the Canaanite healthcare system. And then part 4, I think the final part of this series will be November 27th. We will be featuring Dr. Pekka Matanen and Dr. Joyce Che from Med Missionary. They will be discussing whether God's health message is powerful enough for pandemics. So we ask that you join us again for those dates. Next, some of you have wondered about a longer presentation with Ron Panzer. We had a couple weeks ago discussing bioethics. We want to let you know that we have recorded an extended interview with you, and we will let you know when the video is ready. And finally, for today's meeting, I have an article for you. I think, let's see if I can post that now. Okay. I am posting that in the chat. This article was sent to us from Dr. Martha Leatherman, whom you remember also from our last presentation. This article, I think, is timely for our meeting tonight. This discusses that surprisingly US mortality rates have declined among young people during the lockdown, especially amongst infants. And I imagine the data is probably similar for Canada. These trends have gone largely unnoticed and remained unexplained, but this article, I think you'll be interested to know, features that presentation. Okay, and finally, for our devotion tonight, I am going to read a few verses from 1 Kings chapter 20. And here's the background on that chapter. After the showdown with Elijah and the prophets in Mount Carmel, Ahab and the kingdom of Israel was threatened with war by Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria. Verse 3, Ben-Hadad said to Ahab, "Your silver, your gold, your wives, and your children are all mine." Ahab said in response to this, "I am yours, and everything that I have is yours." Then King Ben-Hadad from Syria answered and said, "Tomorrow about this time, I will send my servants, and they will take whatever they want out of your house, in addition to everything else." Skipping to verse 8, all the elders and all the people said to King Ahab, "Hearken not unto Ben-Hadad, nor consent." I'm going to leave it with you to read the rest of chapter 20 to see how the Lord answered this prayer. But this final word or this final phrase, "do not consent," I think is going to be largely the answer for the people of God to give to this new world order system as it encroaches further and further on religious and health liberties. Please bow your head with me at this time. Dear Heavenly Father, we are in terrible trouble. Not only have we sinned greatly against you, Lord, but the enemy is at the gate and the next frontier is our children. And we just lift this situation up to you. Please deliver us from consenting to this beast system. Please help us to stand against this beast system. We thank you in Jesus' name, amen. For the first part of our presentation, Empowering Parents to Discuss Vaccines, please welcome Joy Astolfi. Joy Astolfi works as a mental health clinician and holds a master's in science degree in marital and family therapy from Loma Linda University. She has worked in private practice, primary care, corrections, and as a consultant. I am turning the floor over to you, Joy.
Well, thank you all so very much for having me this evening, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I have some slides I'm going to share with everyone this evening, and I do want to make a disclaimer, first of all, that I am here to present as a concerned person and citizen. I am not here in a mental health capacity in any way. So I'm just wanting to let people know that up front. So I'm just here, the information I'm providing is for education and information purposes only. To say that the last 20 months have been challenging for families and children is probably the largest understatement so far we've had in that time period. Much has changed in our society, and within our families and churches and society in general. And the focus of my presentation today is to identify some of the dynamics of our current situation and environment, and to assist parents with assisting their children in navigating these changes. So specifically, there has been concern about how to assist children and teens facing scrutiny and at times hostility regarding regarding vaccination choice with their peers and from other sources. So I'm going to just share my screen here with folks. I'm going to go into whoops. So we're going to cover some legal and ethical considerations today. We're going to identify some challenges, provide some guidance and practical tips, interestingly enough, from the CDC, Scripture, and Spirit of Prophecy. And then at the end, we're going to provide you with some hope. So there are some legal and ethical things when it comes to giving consent. And in the years that I've been working in the field, which is over 2 decades, almost 3, those parameters and guidelines and even some of the legalities have changed. So what I'm going to give you is the most up-to-date information that I was able to find. For example, the first one is going to be from the Canadian Code of Ethics for Psychologists. And that code is based on the 4 principles that guide psychological practice in North America, but not the entire world. And those principles are: number 1, respect for the dignity of persons and peoples. Responsible caring is number 2. Integrity in relationships is number 3. And responsibility to society is number 4. And so, and then under the College of Alberta Psychologists, I'm just using that as an example. We are going to look at the definition of a minor and how that is changing and evolving. So, for example, in the case of a minor, and by the way, for those of you who may have some specific questions about your area, it does vary from place to place. So for example, in Alberta, the age of majority is 18, and in BC it is 19. So there's how a child is defined can be legally different, but then there's some categorical issues as well. So just under the Alberta one, what I can share with you is that with minors or those with limited capacity, so this could also be someone who's disabled or not able to speak for themselves, or they typically have a guardianship. Consent for psychological service may be required from someone other than the recipient of the service. And in the case of a minor, consent will need to be obtained from the minor's guardian, parent, divorced parent with legal standing, or appointed case managers authorized by law. Throughout the majority of my career, that is exactly how it's has been. If I was the child was needing some therapy and they were a minor, typically, even if the parents were going through divorce or they were divorced and still had custody, I would have to have a signed informed consent from both parents. So if we go further a little bit here, it's typically recommended that the parent for informed consent, well, this is the current piece, is it typically recommended that parental informed consent is given both parents in a non-intact family and or guardians where applicable. And it is up to the psychologist or therapist, whoever that is, or social worker, to determine how mature status is assessed. Interestingly, there is a contrast when this is done in relating to healthcare or immunization. So one of the links I have here is for the information I got from HealthLink British Columbia, and it states there, I'm just going to read it right from their information. The child who is the minor may make their own healthcare decisions independent of their parents' or guardians' wishes. and that a healthcare provider can accept consent from the child and provide healthcare that is in the child's best interest without getting consent from the parent or guardian if the healthcare provider is sure that the child understands three things. One is the need for the healthcare. The second is what the healthcare involves and the risks and the benefits of the healthcare. So what then does a mature minor consent, how does that relate to immunization? So they go on in this document to state that a child can consent to the vaccine on their own behalf if the child care provider has determined that, the healthcare provider, pardon me, has determined that the child is capable of making that decision. They go on to state that there is no set age for when a child becomes capable. And the common practice is for child or parents or guardians of children in grade 6 to give consent for the children to be immunized. The question begs, though, what is this based on? They go on to state that, however, children in grade 9 and older are given the opportunity to consent for themselves. So if a child refuses a vaccine for which their parent or guardian has consented, they must be informed of the risks of not having it. The immunization records of any child who gives their own consent will not be shared with the parent or guardian unless the child gives permission. So that begs the question, then how does that healthcare provider decide if a child's capable to give consent for immunization? So before accepting consent from a child, a healthcare provider has to give the child information about the vaccination. And they have to provide the following information: which ones they are due to get. So this would be speaking in general, not necessarily for COVID. This is any immunizations. The benefits of getting the immunization, the risks of not getting it, common expected side effects, rare serious side effects, and medical reasons to not receive vaccine. The healthcare provider will give the child time to read over the information and allow the child to ask questions. The child will then be asked some questions to make sure that they understand the information and are ready to make that decision. If the healthcare provider is not sure that a child understands or a child is not ready to make the decision, the child will not be immunized. So my point in drawing out both of these is that for consent regarding minors, there seems to be some inconsistency and perhaps discrepancy between providing therapy or another type of medical procedure. So I'm also encouraging folks out there, when you're making these decisions for your children, or your children can make those decisions, you all need to know what the current the legal aspects or even the guidelines are in your jurisdiction. So this is the site that I got the information for from HealthLink BC. So some of the challenges that we want to identify here now are that there are conflicting and vast amounts of data and information out there on the situation. This long-term situation has produced various types of fatigue and strained relationships. The pressures and stresses faced by a family, that's another huge challenge, of course. Financial, social, psychological, spiritual, emotional, and of course, there's been lots of conflict. So then one of the other challenges is how to initiate and or facilitate developmentally appropriate conversations within our families and with our children and with others outside our families in this regard. So the CDC, interestingly, has some information for us on how to do that. This is a document from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. It is entitled Coping with Stress, and the preamble there, as you can see, is that the outbreak of coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 may be stressful for people and communities. This talks about learning more about how to cope during it. So I've just highlighted some items there. So the CDC outlined some tips for parents. One was to maintain a normal routine, to talk, listen, and encourage expression, watch and listen, to reassure your children about safety and well-being, and connect with others. They had specific tips for kids and teens, and they were to talk to and stay connected to others, to take care of yourself, and to take information breaks. On a couple of places in this document, they identified the need and necessity and benefit to curtailing exposure to news and the information on COVID-19. and to take some breaks. Now we're going to move on to some of the more specific things within families. And one of the things that when dealing with children of any age group, we want to consider that rules without relationship results in rebellion. And so it's important that we, at the undertone, when we are facing critical situations like this, that we are able to have the conversation with our children, but we have got to have healthy relationships within the family established beforehand. And as Christians, we know that some of the main targets in society, in fact, I'd probably say the main one, is to destroy and dismantle the family. And so I want to encourage you all to really look inward at what's happening in your home and being able to create that safe space. And I'm going to talk more about that. So about building the relationship, parents need to be unified on this issue. I've heard repeatedly from another people what is splitting up, whether they're intact families or split families. One of the stressors has been that the parents are not unified on this issue. And it's important that even if you have differing opinions, that you are able to determine a way to express that to the children. And there is, with part of that, to be able to help them develop critical thinking and autonomy to be able to make decisions. Another one is being able to be informed and to keep informed on the topic, not in terms of saturation and overdoing it to the point where it's causing you anxiety and stress, but to be, aware of the science, rights, legal, and the various things that are going on. Another one is to be careful of the situations where the children are placed. So in other words, if you know that there's somebody in particular that might be influential in a way that you don't wish them to be with your child, then then you choose who you have as your cohort for your children are socializing. Now I realize that the audience I'm speaking to are going to have various varying degrees of mandates and restrictions. So there's, based on what it is, for example, in my jurisdiction, they currently have a situation where it's very, your socialization, whether vaccinated or not, is limited. So there are certainly rules for both sets of individuals. So it's also being careful about situations your children are placed in. And as a parent, you can choose that. Minus, of course, school, where there are some protective things that you can put in place for your children. The next one is aspects of building and maintaining family relationships. So parents, of course, where it's possible to operate as a cohesive unit. And I really have to give a shout out to my lovely, lovely friend, Kim Bialy, who is a child therapist and has years of experience in this area. And she has helped me develop a lot of this that I'm going to be presenting with you in this area now. Parents must also model trust in God and display this in earnest. It's also helpful to utilize tensions as a learning opportunity. So there's always teaching and learning opportunities, how to navigate difficult situations, how to utilize critical thinking, diplomacy. And we can take some of these awful situations and use them as teaching tools. We can teach our children how to reason and make choices and experience peace. Part of building and maintaining the family relationship is also to have family meetings, have these regularly, have them open, be able to have open discussions, find out what your children are what is bothering them, what is concerning them. And if you don't have the answers, find them for them. Creating a safe space at home is absolutely critical. School may be a tough place for some of these kids right now. They may not be feeling comfortable. They may be feeling really picked on. So that safe space can be created by regular and open dialogue, unconditional love, and positive regard for the children. Really being able to listen to them. Not only just hearing what they're saying, but active listening to them. Being non-judgmental and understanding and reiterating that opinions and choice are important. And then to develop an understanding on health and immunity. Some practical tips on further developing some of the previous tips are developing cohorts with like-minded families. This will give outlets for children to be able to have a safe space, to be able to socialize. And this goes for the parents as well. Being able to, the next point is to press together. Pressing together is really important because it builds up your courage. It creates peace and community, which with being isolated has largely been dismantled in many places. So it's about being able to do that. Forming strong bonds and network, even with people that are far away. If you're able to do some Zoom time, you're able to do some phone calls or FaceTime, whatever that might be, but be able to keep and form those strong bonds and network. Family and faith community cohesiveness. And this is going to vary from place to place, but with the faith communities, some people have not been able to attend church for some while, or they're observing it online or live stream, but still being able to have those activities and those practices in the home is really important. And then to develop a plan with your children to address any peer pressure. This can be challenging in some respects because you have to also keep in mind that it needs to be age appropriate. And so what's going to be suitable for your 6-year-old who's going to grade 1 is going to be different from the teenager in grade 10. It's also about knowing your children, the temperament of them. So we also launch into the importance of friendships and how our children can still create creative connections and activities with their friends during this time as well. It's about being able to address signs of depression and anxiety immediately through family support and, if needed, with a professional or online group. Children are going to start, the isolation has affected many of them. There's a plethora of articles being written right now. Some studies, I don't know exactly of specific studies going on. I've heard about them. But in my LinkedIn feed, I'm, repeatedly getting articles written on this very issue about how this is impacting our teens and our children. Of course, once again, being age appropriate and perhaps even pooling your resources with other families to do presentations and to present information to your children. One of the big things is to also facilitate personal agency and autonomy in the children. This sets the groundwork for them being able to make some of those decisions and to be able to navigate some of the critical and complicated waters that we often find in our society. So it promotes critical thinking. Moderate the interactions with your child's temperament. Of course, keeping that in mind, some children are going to be perhaps more withdrawn, some more gregarious, so being able to also adapt to that, to leave that open space for them to communicate with you and to be able to express some concerns and stresses and just, to be so that you can be there as a support for that child. One of the big things, as we know in developmental stages, is the development of the frontal lobe of the brain. This is a particular area of interest for me. And this critical stage, of course, begins sometimes between the ages of 12 to 14 and doesn't complete till the age of 25 to 30. However, that being said, that some of the precursors and the groundwork can certainly be laid in younger children as well by helping them to develop good practices. So some of these things, there's the famous marshmallow study of delayed gratification in 4-year-olds, but utilizing this opportunity with COVID to teach delayed gratification. In other words, if you're not able to see your friends or some of the things that we want right now we can't have, or even delayed gratification for our eternal home and what we are striving towards can be done during this time. We've been developed into a society where we want everything and we want it now. And I call it the microwave society, where you just press the button and it comes out, done. Life isn't like that, and especially not like that now. So being able to utilize some of these opportunities to teach some of these realities to our children. Also to encourage and facilitate critical thinking, putting the pieces together, using cause and effect. And that can be done in many ways, as you discuss these issues that are near and dear to your children's hearts. One other opportunity, of course, is to link the frontal lobe to scripture. And we are heading into very serious times where in Revelation, the seal and the mark are going to be discussed. And those, both the place where both the seal and mark are received is in the forehead. The mark is also received in the hand, but to remember that that choice is the conscious one. That choice utilizes critical thinking. So being able to give a bigger picture to your children might also be really helpful during this time, and really encourage them. This whole organization of Health and Liberty Canada is about freedom of choice and enabling people to choose based on their conscience. And so utilizing this also to encourage freedom of informed choice with your children. So some further practical tips that I would really recommend is I really recommend the book Child Guidance on how parents can interact with their children on a number of different areas and levels, and also the Adventist Home about creating that atmosphere in the home. There's a lot of information in both of those. And then there's something new that just came to my attention. It's called Young Disciples. And it's, I believe, a Protestant organization who has encouraged young people to, if they need a spiritual boost during these uncertain times, and it talks about, they've got a magazine I've just shown you here on the screen, Young Disciples Ministries. And they've got free downloads, they've got a whole, just a ton of information on there for age appropriateness. And their goal is to strengthen young people by helping them to make a strong spiritual stand, or with or without the presence of their parents. It also familiarizes them with Protestant history and heroes. So I want to also outline and just say there, just talk about some scripture that we can also use. And this one's from Deuteronomy 6:6-8. And these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them to your children diligently. And you shall talk about them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them for a sign upon your head, and they shall be as frontlets between the eyes. There's that frontal lobe reference again, but how we can do this for our children. Then we've got Psalm 56:4. In God I will praise his word, and in God I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do unto me. Then some inspiration from Spirit of Prophecy. If children would be more familiar with their parents, if they would, I'm sorry, I copied this from a site. It's actually, children would be more familiar with their parents if they would confide in them. So in other words, if you're familiar with the parent, you're going to be more comfortable to confide in them. In order for children to be familiar and to confide in their parents, how strong a relationship needs to be established and how. So this is basically that foundation that we were talking about before, that dialogue, that connection and attachment to the parent, regardless of the age, is going to be really important to have that bond. And then it's reciprocal, because the child's going to feel comfortable with the parent and vice versa. And it won't be like two people that haven't talked for a while or kind of distant relatives. You're actually going to have that bond. So from Christian leadership, press together, be of one mind and of one judgment. Christ is the leader and you are brethren. Follow him. Walk in the light as he is in the light. Those who walk in the footsteps of Christ shall not walk in darkness, but those who draw apart in unsanctified independence cannot have God's presence and blessing in the work. So in other words, during these times, we need that cohesiveness, unity, and bonding more than ever. So I just want to leave you with a couple of items of hope. Encourage children that we can get this through Christ. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that's Philippians 4:13. And finally, rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. And part of my screen is blocked here. I can't see the other word here right now. Who sit in darkness, the Lord shall be a light unto me, Micah 7:8. That is the end of my presentation. Natalie, did we have any questions?
Yes, there was a question. Let's see. The question, sorry about that. Someone remarked, you stated relationship without rules equals. Do you remember the end of
Yes,
that?
yes. Relationship without rules results in rebellion.
Okay.
So it's really hard to, so even when we look at effective principles of discipline, it's far more effective when you have the relationship with the child, because if you're just placing rules and discipline without a relationship, there's a tendency, and this has been, we've seen this many times. I will be frank, I experienced that in my own life as a child. And so we just want to make sure that we have the relationship, and and that's through that dialogue and through that critical thinking.
Okay, thank you very much. Our community is very grateful to you, Joy, for your presentation during this difficult time, and we look forward to hearing from you again in another seminar. Let's see. Okay, before I announce our next guest, I am going to share my screen for a little bit to set up the conversation here. So let me see. Give me just a minute. Okay, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Let's see, can we? Nope, I should be fine. So let me try that again. Okay. All right, so before we enter into this next part, I would like to remind you all, a couple weeks ago when Nwamika was sharing his presentation, he said the people of God should be faith-based first, and then science-based or evidence-based secondly. And he gave the documentation and the support for that. That was such an excellent presentation. And for me, that was very paradigm shifting in my mind. And I want to present this information with that understanding, because a few thousand years ago, our scientific dilemmas, our pandemics were anticipated. And so instruction was given, faith-based instruction was given. And I'm going to go over that now, and then we are going to have Pamela Acker, whom I will introduce next. She will give us the science to support the faith. So this is a quick little screen showing biblical principles for considering a vaccine or not. Principle number 1, thou shalt not kill or murder, as we know. That is found in Exodus 20:13. Does a vaccine involve fetuses at any stage? Principle number 2, thou shalt not mix kind with diverse kind, Leviticus 19:19. Is there or are there any human-animal chimeras involved? Principle number 3, thou shalt not use unclean animal, Leviticus 11:4. Are there any unclean animals that are involved in the development and making of these vaccinations? And then finally, here's a final question that is really for our modern age. Does it have any toxic chemicals that are known to human physiological processes? Okay. With that said, I am going to introduce Pamela Acker, our next guest. Pamela, hello. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm so excited.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Welcome. We are going to be discussing the information included in your book, Vaccination, A Catholic Perspective. Before I get into that, let me share one more thing here. Let's see. I would like to ask you a question about your book. I think, Sorry, everyone going through this. Okay, I have two books here. I have Vaccination, A Catholic Perspective. I purchased two of these, by the way. And then the second one I have is this one called The Science, Morality, and Safety of Vaccines. I showed that this is available for sale in Australia. So I'm wondering if you could talk with me about the difference between these two books.
They're actually the same book, but they were printed in. So the book has actually been translated into several different languages, and it was printed in the UK and then also in Australia under the title "The Science, Morality, and Safety of Vaccines," and that was based on some input from our colleagues over there in the Kolbe Center. They thought that would be a better title for the UK and Australia. Both are more secular countries, and so putting it under a religious title they thought was a little bit off-putting. So we changed the title for the international distribution. But it's the same text. So
I would like to purchase a couple of these covers because I have, well, for scientists and some people in the medical community, I think that might be a little bit more appealing to them.
Sure.
So maybe I'll talk with you about, well, actually, are there any available of this cover in the United States?
I don't know. I'd have to check with our guy who does the distribution on the books. We're actually working on a second edition that should be good to go in the next couple of months. And I think we'll go with this cover for that edition, just because the issue has gotten so much bigger than Catholic moral ethics, which is kind of what started me on this whole vaccine journey anyway. Was the use of the aborted fetal cells in the vaccines, and as a Catholic, that was something I couldn't condone, especially being someone who was involved in actually researching and developing vaccines.
Okay, thank you. Now I am going to introduce you. Biologist Pamela Acker holds a Master's of Science. Her book provides a balanced examination of the whole subject of vaccination from a Catholic perspective, which will allow Catholic leaders to parents and teachers to make an informed judgment on proposals to mandate vaccinations for the novel coronavirus or other infectious diseases. The author is ideally qualified to undertake this task. A devout Catholic with a master's degree in biology from the Catholic University of America, Pamela worked in the field of vaccine development and has the right combination of knowledge and experience to evaluate the scientific basis for vaccinations as currently practiced. Pamela Acker currently works as a teacher and for the St. Maximilian Kolbe Center. This is a creation science organization that teaches the young earth theory and is dedicated to supporting science in the inerrant word of God. I would like to add, in my personal feeling, Pamela's most laudable achievement has been to build up the people of God for all different denominations, and we are so excited to have you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have put together some questions, and this is a tall order. We're going to try and get through all of this. So for question number 1, Pamela, you were educated as a vaccine researcher. Will you please share with our audience how you became aware of fetal cells in vaccinology, the use of fetuses in research, and in conjunction with us, will you please tell us about the circumstances that prevented the completion of your doctoral studies? And finally, will you please share with us how God directed your career after your decision?
Sure. I started working on my PhD, well, okay, it goes further back than that. About 22 years ago, I was a high school student and I was looking at, what I wanted to do with my life. And I was very interested in immunology and very interested in genetics and very interested in the pro-life movement. And kind of a way to put all these things together was looking at the development of ethical vaccines. And at the time, there was only one Catholic organization that was kind of interested in really being vocal about this. And they're called Children of God for Life. And I don't know how I stumbled across their website. It was very providential, I'm sure. And they had some information on which vaccines were morally acceptable and which vaccines were produced using aborted fetal cells. and they had a lot of information about the science behind it. And I didn't look into it super closely. I just kind of said, oh, well, if these things are in existence and there's no ethical alternatives, then, you know, maybe that's something that I could choose to pursue as a research angle. So I went to my undergrad hoping that I would be able to graduate and work at an organization called the Danforth Center, where they were trying to develop edible vaccines. And these were basically, the idea was that you could genetically modify a plant in order to cause it to produce a vaccine antigen. So then you could just consume the edible part of the plant and you'd be vaccinated for, you know, smallpox or something like that. One of the major advantages of this was supposed to be that you could grow these in third world countries directly, so people could grow them and harvest them there, and you wouldn't have the problem of shipping and storing things that weren't heat stable or shelf stable, because most vaccines need to be kept at consistent temperatures and specific kinds of treatment in order to not go bad. And it seemed like a really great idea at the time, but by the time I graduated in 2004, they had stopped this program because they were unable to standardize the dosages that these edible vaccines were going to deliver. So about 6 to 8 years later, I went back to graduate school. And in 2010, I started my PhD at Catholic University of America. And we were looking at developing vaccines against anthrax and plague when I entered the lab. And right as I joined the lab, or right before I joined the lab, they also picked up a project for an HIV vaccine. And I was super excited about anthrax and plague because my dad was in the Air Force. So fighting bioterrorism seemed like a good thing to couple with ethical vaccine development, because we were using a virus as a vector, which most people have heard of viral vector vaccines now because of Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. The COVID vaccines use an adenovirus to deliver the vaccine component to the human body. We were trying to use a T4 bacteriophage, which is a virus that normally infects E. coli. So it's going to be completely harmless to humans, and you can't grow it in human cells because it won't grow in human cells, it grows in bacteria. So I thought that'd be a great way to kind of get into the ethical side of vaccine development. But I got put into the HIV project when I came into the lab because that was where they were shunting a lot of the resources and talent in the lab. And so I was working in different cell lines. I was trying to target the vaccine delivery mechanism to a specific subset of immune cells. And because I was trying to do this in this way, I was working in with some hamster cells and some mouse cells and a human cancer cell line. And then the lab as a whole, I didn't find out until 6 or 7 months into the project, was actually using the HEK293 cells that everyone has now heard of because of the COVID vaccines. They were using these cells to produce the vaccine antigens. So I was kind of looking at one aspect of the platform. I was looking at a targeting molecule. Some other people were looking at the vaccine vector itself. Some other people were looking at the HIV antigens that were going to be sort of loaded onto the vaccine vector. And it was this, aspect of the project over here that was using aborted fetal cells. And when I found that out, I realized I had a decision to make. I could continue in the lab and try to, keep my part of the project as ethical as possible while working on a vaccine that was still inherently unethical and was exactly what I came there to not do and to combat. Or I could say, I can't look at myself in the mirror doing this. And that was ultimately the decision that I made, was that I cannot do that which I came to fight. And I graduated with my master's degree in 2012 as a consolation prize because I was unable to complete my PhD at Catholic U because after refusing to work on the aborted fetal cells, I was not able to stay in the virology lab, and I was not able to transfer into another lab that really was had research that was interesting enough for me to stick around and spend the next 5 to 6 years doing it, plus a postdoc and all that. So after that, I ended up teaching quite a bit, middle school and high school, and ended up also working with the Kolbe Center starting, I guess, a year or two after I finished my master's. I met Hugh Owen for the first time when he gave a conference at this a parish near where I lived in Virginia at the time. And he just kind of had a remarkable perspective on life that I had never really encountered before. And I ended up presenting with them, and he ended up asking me to write a book on vaccination just as a general medical paradigm about a year before COVID hit. And it ended up being really, really providential then, because, you know, I already had kind of all the background of, you know, why do we vaccinate? What are we trying to accomplish here? Is it accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish? And what are some of the side effects, safety issues, moral issues, ethical issues? It tied right in with my research as a vaccine developer, and it tied right in with my interest in the way that the pro-life stance is connected to the use of aborted fetal cells in vaccines. So it's kind of a long story, but that's how I got here. And our Lord obviously pulled all of that together into this one, you know, sort of interesting moment in history where this has become a question that we're all having to ask ourselves, because prior to COVID, there are aborted fetal cell vaccines that are used commonly. The MMR is one, the chickenpox vaccine is one. People weren't really asking these questions. People weren't necessarily even aware that these vaccines were produced using aborted fetal cells. Now almost everyone is aware of this issue, and it's become a front page issue. And it's really an amazing opportunity to stand up for life, and particularly in an area where the culture of death is kind of hidden. It kind of hides behind this veneer of scientific experimentation in the biomedical research.
Yes, thank you for that background. It has been, I find your story fascinating and providential. And like you said, the Lord wove so many strands together. Pamela, I have seen a few of your interviews online, and you are one popular lady right now. And I also want to say it's incredibly brave of you, because I imagine you are not a friend of the vaccine community now, the vaccine researcher community. I'm not even sure what vaccinology is that. I don't know quite what to call the field. So
yeah, vaccine development.
Okay.
I certainly, you know, if Paul Offit knows who I am, he's probably doesn't like me. But you know, what I found more interesting and frustrating, and I think you expressed some of this in terms of your own faith community, is the people who are of very good will, but really don't understand the science, who kind of come along and you know, take issue with my position and my credentials, because they want to say, no, this is perfectly acceptable. We don't have to worry about the connection with the aborted fetal cells because it was just one abortion. It happened a long time ago. You know, whatever kind of moral distance they want to place between that horrific sin and this current question of, you know, whether I take the COVID jab or not. And so it's been a very interesting occurrence. I didn't ever expect to create an international stir.
Well, I am so very glad you did. And I want to take a moment to quote something, a statement from the Catholic World Report, part number 2, which I am going to share with our group in a second. But these 2 sentences I thought were very profound. They state, "This is where fetal cell lines come from. We must not let our revulsion draw a mental veil over the horrific details to the detriment of our understanding." And as we have been going down this rabbit hole, as I've been going down this rabbit hole, at times I am horrified beyond belief at how dark our scientific community in general is, and then how dark we as a people are as well, because this is for many of us a sin of ignorance. But anyway, so I am going to post the link right now to let's see, was it Dr. Wan's The Ethics of yes, Dr.
The
Wong's
ethics of HEK.
The Ethics of HEK 293. And that is where your first conscience of crisis of conscience came. So everyone can read that and should read that. I have read so much this past month. I think I'm pretty familiar with this topic, but I'm going to show everybody a picture, and then I'm going to ask the next question here. So okay, let's see here. The picture that I want to show everyone, oh boy, I hope I didn't delete it. Here it is. Okay, so this is a picture that was in my mind before this discussion began. Here is a Petri dish. there are some cells. This is what fetal cells look like. No big deal. What is, and every time I read an article online about fetal cells, or from a research paper, or from some hospital describing what the vaccines are, this is what has been in my mind. And furthermore, I think this is the idea that is communicated to the reader, that it's just a fetal cell, no big deal. However, we know that there is a different picture, and we're going to talk about that. Anyway, moving on to the next question. We know that HEK, this is the fetal cell line, originated from a fetus over 50 years ago. Those human cells can only be divided 50 times. Can you please open our minds to this whole situation? And the questions are, how are 50-year-old cells immortal? We know that there's a global demand for fetuses. So how are cells that are 50 years old still giving fetuses to everybody and their scientific research? How are cells used in development, testing, and production? And then I guess I will show some statements from the vaccine companies about their own vaccine. So please go ahead first.
Sure, that's a lot. But I will first point out that the cells that you actually pictured were bacterial cells. Human cells, they look a little bit different. They're transparent, and they tend to coat the bottom of a petri dish, and there's liquid medium on the top. But it's still kind of, we get very removed from, where did these things actually come from? So you mentioned, cells dividing in culture. There's something called the Hayflick limit, where if you take cells out of my arm, for example, and skin cells, and you put them in a petri dish, they'll divide for about 50 times before they senesce and die. Maybe slightly less than that, depending on how old I am. So in order to get a cell line in culture, you have to, one of the important things that I think everybody kind of needs to understand is that you cannot put cells in a petri dish that will survive in a petri dish for any length of time unless those cells are living. And you cannot take living cells out of dead tissue, and you cannot take living tissue, with some exceptions, out of a dead body. Now, we know this from organ donation. They actually will remove the organ from the body. Unfortunately, sometimes in cases of brain death, before the person is actually completely dead, but they'll remove the organ from the body, because if you leave an organ in a dead body, it deteriorates. And there's some really kind of profound quotes I can share here from some embryologists, and even from some folks who provide fetal tissue for research. So keep in mind that in order to put living cells into a petri dish, you have to have living cells coming from living tissue, which comes from a living body. Okay, so if it's an adult, you can do this without killing the person. If it's a pre-viable fetus, usually the baby dies in the interim, either because they're extracting tremendous amounts of tissue or tissue from vital organs, or because of what's called benign neglect, where you just kind of don't actually intervene, and then the baby passes away after the tissue extraction. So in order to have a cell line developed, once you've taken the tissue out of the individual, you do one of two things. So in your cells, you have things that are called tumor suppressor genes, and you can think of these as kind of brakes on cancer, and you have oncogenes, and you can think of these as kind of the gas pedal on cancer. So in order not to have cancer, you need the brake on and the gas off. So to create an immortalized cell line, what scientists will do is they will go into, they will genetically modify these cells, and they will do one of two things, or both of them together. They will either take the brake off of the tumor suppressor, so they will turn off the tumor suppressor gene, and that will allow the cells to continue to divide extra times in culture, or they will add an oncogene. They will turn on the gas for that cancer causing gene, or they will take off the brake and turn on the gas at the same time. And that can get very complicated and technical, but basically in order to develop a cell line, you have to mutate it to make it behave like a cancer cell. And so that's what was done with these cells that were taken from aborted babies. and particularly in HEK 293, that baby, was a little girl, was aborted in the 1970s. And her cells are still dividing in labs around the world because of the mutagenesis that was performed in the laboratory. Now, another thing that most people don't realize, there's a lot of vaccine researchers out there who say, oh, it was only one abortion, or it was only 2 abortions, or it was only, whatever. In the first place, one abortion is still a horrific crime. The killing of the unborn is always a terrible crime. And we can't really, it doesn't make it a worse crime when you add more abortions on top of it. But for the MMR vaccine, for example, there was a fetal cell line that was developed to culture the rubella virus, because you can't make a virus outside of a cell. Since viruses are obligate parasites, they actually need to grow in a cellular host, which is why we use cell lines in the first place. And there were 32 babies that were aborted before they finally actually had a viable cell line. So the cell line came from the 32nd baby. It was the 38th tissue extraction. So the cell line was named WI38. And then in order to obtain the virus that they use, in Japan, they actually just took a nasal swab and they swabbed a school-age child who had rubella. In the US, they asked women to selectively abort their children after they were exposed to the rubella virus. And then they tried to extract the rubella virus from the aborted fetal tissue. And that ended up totaling 67 abortions just for the rubella vaccine alone. So that one vaccine is based on 99 abortions. And the cell lines that we're using, they don't require fresh input of tissue, which I think some people are concerned about. They're like, well, how do these things keep going? Or are we continuing to have abortions, every 50 divisions so that we can still replenish these cell lines? No, but in many cases, there was far more than one abortion, because the scientists actually failed to develop cell lines for a number of times before they got a viable cell line. And then even though the cells are said to be immortalized, they're not, strictly speaking, immortal. These cell lines can still themselves senesce and die, usually long after the Hayflick limit. But this is happening with the MRC5 and the WI38 fetal cell lines. They're degrading in the lab over time. And so in 2015, a new cell line, Walvax2, was created in China, and they specifically looked for a fetus of the same age and gender as these other cell lines in order to replace what they were unable to obtain. So there's kind of, on the one hand, this sort of dismissive idea that because the cell lines are immortalized, we don't really need to worry about any additional abortions happening. And on the other hand, there's this idea that, are these things being fed by constant abortions? Neither of those is actually true. The truth is somewhere in the middle, where there definitely was more than one abortion involved in developing the fetal line in the first place, because there were abortions that basically resulted in failed cell lines until you finally got a viable cell line. And once the cell line runs out, there will be more abortions required to produce new cell lines. But there's a deeper connection here to ongoing biomedical research that does involve fresh fetal tissue. And some people are familiar with the concept of humanized mice and actually grafting tissue from babies onto mice and then doing experiments in them that way. This isn't my area of expertise, but I have looked at it in terms of how this particular kind of field of research, which does involve, continual infusions of fresh tissue, which means it does require continual abortions. The justification for this kind of research always goes back to, well, we produce these life-saving vaccines in aborted fetal cell lines. And since we've made this life-saving medical intervention using aborted fetal tissue, we need to keep using aborted fetal tissue to make more life-saving medical interventions. And so there's a lot of complicated connection here that it goes beyond just, does this particular cell line require new abortions? No, it doesn't. Therefore, there's no connection to continuing, fueling abortions in biomedical research. There is a connection. It's just not that explicit, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for making that understandable and approachable to us lay people. let's see here. I am going to take a moment and post. I'm going to post, let's see here. I'm going to post the articles that you are really famous for. And that is from the Catholic World Report. We've posted this in the past, but this is part 1 and part 2. I'm going to post the link to this. And then I'm going to share a couple of things here. The reason I'm going to post this is because everything you want to know about this subject, you can start by finding here. There are so many citations and sources that I have been running them down, except one I did not run down was Stanley Plotkin's book, his textbook, because that was 1,800 pages long and I just couldn't.
Yeah, it's also like almost $300.
Yeah, that too. And I was going to rent it for $54. And then I'm like, but I won't be able to read it in time. So anyway, moving on. Okay, so of course you can't see this, but this is the fetus as a transplant donor. This was hard, but to get a hold of, but the Lord answered this, and that was really a blessing. So, okay, I'm going to post these. And then the reason I'm going to post this is because someone in the chat brought up these several research here. Tyrone Jackson, thank you for submitting this information. These papers, ethical issues surrounding the transplantation of human fetal tissues. Are there really alternatives to the use of fetal tissues from elective abortions? All of this. We are aware of this information. Thank you so much, Tyrone. And I'm going to put that in the chat, or put these articles in the chat so everybody can see that. But before I do that, I also want to, I have a question here. This says, is there somewhere we can find out how many fetuses were aborted for all the various vaccines and drugs that have been developed for using fetal cell lines?
So there's definitely a source where you can find that information for vaccines, and that's all posted on Children of God for Life. And that's COGFORlife.org. Okay.
And then for question number 3, I am going to bring Grace McIntosh. She's with us already, so I am going to let her join and speak into this. Grace, if you're ready, go ahead.
Hi, I hope you can see me.
Yes.
It's a real honor to meet you, and I've been reading your work and trying to follow your sources. Natalie has been able to do a little bit more reading than I've been able to do, but I wanted to just ask some questions. It can be surface tonight, but we wanted to raise some of the realities, I guess, that seem to be apparent in a study that was published. It was first published in August of 2020, and then it was posted on January 29th, 2021. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, Natalie's going to stop sharing her screen, and then I'll be able to share my. Thank you so much. You have so much information, and yet you present it in a way that all the dots connect nicely. Thank you for that.
That's where the teaching high school and middle school came in as part of my preparation for what I'm doing now.
Very much appreciated. Okay, so just so you can see and everybody can see. So as you can see on the top here, so this is from a bio treatment XIV, BioRxiv preprint. And so that was printed in August of 2020. And then you can see it was posted in January 29, 2021. And the title is Human Immune System, HIS, Humanized Mouse Model. And then they have the name of the mouse. So they get very long. Mm-hmm. And there are several researchers that are listed there. And I'm just going to read the abstract. So we report the first human immune system humanized mouse model for COVID-19 research. So they're very excited, right? Because now they had a mouse that has a human immune system. So this mouse is reconstituted with human cord blood derived. Do you think that was fetal? Do they typically, when they humanize the mice, is it fetal cells or fetal organs that are, I know you said this wasn't your, so we're not going to land on it and stay here for a long time, but is that, we'd have to be.
Yeah, so the experiments I'm most familiar with are ones that use grafting of skin or pieces of organ into mice, and that is generally from fetal tissue. Cord blood is actually usually, and I'd have to read the materials and methods on the specific paper. And even then it might not be clear, because sometimes there's a lot of obfuscation in the current scientific papers around, exactly how this was obtained, what the state of the baby was at the time. But usually cord blood is actually obtained from the umbilical cord, and it's usually obtained, it can very well be obtained in a way that is perfectly ethical. And in fact, there's a Catholic organization, I believe it's the John Paul II Institute, that's working on developing a cord blood cell line, so that this cell line should match in some ways the general characteristics of fetal cells, but not be derived in an unethical manner, be derived from totally ethical tissue that was obtained after a successful birth and did not involve the harming of either mother or child. So I would be hopeful that would be obtained in an ethical way. But I think, and you probably are aware from this discussion that Natalie was mentioning earlier, even if this was ethical, there's simply the problem of you're putting human tissue into a mouse, and there's tremendous moral and ethical implications of that, even if it's done in an ethical manner.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
So it was reconstituted with human cord blood derived HLA matched hematopoietic stem cells. It engrafts human API/endothelial cells. So it sounds like there's a grafting of the first layer of skin expressing the ACE2 receptor. Am I understanding that correctly?
That actually sounds correct. Endothelial should be skin cells.
Yeah, endothelial cells. So there's a grafting there that happened, and for the SARS-CoV-2 and TMPRSS2 serine protease co-localized on lung epithelia.
A quick correction. So endothelial, specifically, the endothelium is actually a membrane that lines the heart and the blood vessels. So that's that would, depending on where they were taking it from, that would probably involve the death of the individual who donated it if they were taking lining from around the heart.
Mm-hmm.
If they're taking this endothelial tissue from the umbilical cord, then it could potentially be ethical.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you'd have to kind of look at the epithelial is skin, endothelial is basically the tissue that lines the inside of your body.
Thank you for that differentiation. So showing deteriorated clinical condition, replicating virus in lungs and human-like lung immunopathology, including T-cell infiltrates, microthrombi, and pulmonary, how do you say that word?
Sequelae. So that's just things that happen after a disease course goes through the body. So if you've heard of long COVID, there's certain folks have, and I actually had this when I had COVID, you might continue to not be able to not have your sense of smell even after you recover, or continue to have brain fog for a while after you recover, things like that. Some people have very severe sequelae, like they can't walk, or they can't exercise because of damage to their cardiovascular system, things like that.
Thank you. Among T-cell infiltrates, lung resident CD8 T cells were sequestered in epithelial CD326. And these numbers like CD103, CD8 T cells, CD3, do you know what that's referring to?
It's referring to specific receptors that are located on the outside of the cells. So it's just it's a way to determine exactly, it's a very technical way for the people who are reading the paper to determine exactly which cells in the immune system we're looking at here.
Thank you. Lung niches and secreted granzyme B and perforin indicating cytotoxic potential. Infected mice also developed antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 viral proteins. Hence, HAS draga, which is deer in Yugoslavia, mice, so these humanized mice, showed unique advantages as a surrogate in vivo human model for studying SARS-CoV-2 immunopathology and for testing the safety and efficacy of candidate vaccines and therapeutics. I'm assuming for SARS-CoV-2.
Right.
So this is indicating that they've developed this humanized mice and they are going to be used. I feel like there's pictures in this one, but I could be wrong about that. And they're very excited because it was the first time they had a mouse with a human immune system. No,
Grace.
Not the one with the pictures. Yes.
Grace, I do have that. I will share it on the screen and I'll scroll to the part. I don't think it was this one that had the mouse pictures. Hang on a second so you can refer to it. And it is in the results section. Actually, I should ask, would you like me to share that
Yes,
or
please.
do you need that?
I was just scrambling to find the stop share.
Okay.
So
All
now
right.
I stopped sharing.
All right, so let me get down over here and then I will scoot out of the discussion.
So we're in the Nature magazine.
Yes, this is the Nature.
Yeah,
And,
this is the one I've seen before. It's just really sad.
Okay, so this is the human skin and in the mouse or rat, and then I believe human organs. And Grace, I'm going to scroll down to the section that I think this as well. And then please go ahead. Maybe it's, I think, did you want to talk about the immune system again or some of the diseases that were tested? If
So
you
here-
did, that's in this area, and go ahead, please continue.
Yeah, so the human skin xenograft so that means human skin grafted onto an animal. Is that correct? Human skin.
That's correct. Mhm.
On SRG rats supports CA-MRSA infection, community-associated methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus was inoculated into human skin xenograft on humanized human skin SRG rats to demonstrate that the human skin xenograft supports CA-MRSA infection. A gross analysis of the skin tissues were examined in CA-MRSA inoculated humanized human skin and CRG rats and compared to the CA-MRS infected human skin. And I just think that this is illustrative of the extent that they've gone to. My understanding is that they are grafting the skin of fetuses onto the mice. And so maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong about that, or
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. I recall, I think these specific pictures from an article that was posted in January. I think it was January of this year by Dr. Stacy Trasancos. So Dr. Jose and Dr. Stacy Trasancos they've taken over the administration of the Children of God for Life website from Debbie Venage, who founded it about the time that I found it, actually. And Dr. Stacy has done a number of different articles highlighting current uses of aborted fetal tissue in biomedical research, and I believe she highlighted this specific paper. So the skin grafts that we saw in that first picture that you pulled up were from the scalps of babies that had been aborted, and that's why the hair is of a different color than on the mouse. So again, you'd have to kind of read specifically through the methods to see if this to see exactly how this tissue was obtained. But if memory serves, I believe it was obtained from aborted fetuses, and this is something that's been reported on before, even all the way back to 2015. I think I found an article basically describing how the lab required fresh fetal tissue and on specifically what time schedule it was. And I don't know if they got that from the Karolinska Institute or not. That's in a group in Sweden that you can submit your research proposal to them, and as long as you have cleared whatever your country's ethical screening for human tissue research is, and most of them don't have really tight restrictions on fetal tissue research at this juncture. We've been gradually lifting restrictions since the Clinton era. Then the Karolinska Institute will send you fetal tissue on your whatever time schedule you would like. And it's kind of chilling to actually have gone onto their website and looked at, this landing page of, basically, they're not saying it in these words exactly, but, we're your one-stop fetal tissue shop, and happily provide whatever researchers are wanting to work on. So when you're dealing with skin tissue, there is the possibility that it was not taken from a live fetus, because skin, I think, can maintain its coherency for up to 24 hours after death, but it's also not possible that it's taken from naturally miscarried fetuses, because naturally miscarried fetuses usually die more than 24 hours before they're expelled from their mother's body. And so you can't get this tissue through any means other than abortion, which is really very sad and very disturbing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very sad and it is very disturbing. With respect to the commodification of abortions or fetuses, do you have any idea? I understand that there have been relaxing of restrictions since the Clinton era. I heard you say that. Do you have any updates with respect to what's happened in the last 2 years in the United States in particular?
Yeah, specifically what's happened in the last 2 years. I'm actually pulling up an article I wrote for LifeSite to check and see if I did. Because I don't think that there have been notable, I'll just drop this in the comments too. I don't think there have been notable updates to the restrictions here in the US just in the last couple of years. I think that they were already pretty free in terms of what was permissible and what was not, because at this point, we're as of 2009, the restrictions on embryonic stem cells allowed researchers to purposefully obtain them, which means you're actually using in vitro fertilization to create more embryos, and then you're destroying those embryos. And if we're doing that, and that's perfectly legal, the use of aborted fetal tissue is usually less restricted than the embryonic stem cells, because the idea, even though it's not accurate, but the idea is that, oh, well, the abortion is going to happen anyway, and so we don't really need to have as strict an oversight over that as we do over the embryonic stem cells. So I don't think there's necessarily been a lot of loosening of restrictions just in the last couple of years. I think the restrictions were already sufficiently loose for all the things that we're seeing to be going on in a perfectly legal way, unfortunately.
And as I use the word commodification because I understand that it's an industry. I did see like a clip of an undercover, it was like a sales barn almost with respect to fetal cells, fetuses, and they were offering 16 weeks, 22 weeks, so and so cells, 2-week fetuses. Where do they purchase? Like, these are like labs, and where did they get the fetuses from? Like, where's the purchasing coming from? Because aren't there laws purchasing from Planned Parenthood and so on?
Well, there's see, this gets into very, very sticky waters that are very hard to confirm. Planned Parenthood can donate fetal tissue for research perfectly legally. They simply cannot sell it. So whether they sell it or not, they are providing this tissue. And even if there's not money changing hands, I would still consider this to be human trafficking. You're passing along another human being for someone else's use for their gain. That's not an acceptable thing to do with the human body at any stage. And there's a tremendous problem with that. So I never could actually track down whether Planned Parenthood was receiving money for the tissue or not, but they were clear that they were actually donating tissue for research. So this is one place this tissue can be obtained. Sometimes in the past, in like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, it was often obtained through delivery wards in not delivery, but like Bellevue Hospital, and there were a couple other places that did they did forced sterilization of women who were deemed unfit to have children. And so sometimes when they were doing the forced sterilization, they did an abortion at the same time. And so they were obtaining tissue from these places. In Sweden, abortion was legalized much earlier than here, I think. And even if it wasn't across the board legal, they were still, the Karolinska Institute in Sweden was actually providing fetal tissue for a lot of places in the world. This is, they would remove it from the babies, and then as we know with organ donation, you can put an organ on ice for a certain period of time to keep its tissue stable, and you can transport that organ to another place. So they were providing tissue for a lot of places in Europe, still are providing tissue. But I haven't tracked down all of the possible sources of it. Those are the main ones that I'm familiar with.
So once it leaves Planned Parenthood, then it is a huge industry. I understand from an article that I just read recently that a little vial of the cells can cost thousands of dollars. So once it gets to the labs and it's being sold around the world and to researchers.
Oh yeah, once you make a cell line, certainly you're making money off of that tissue. And once you make a pharmaceutical product, certainly you're making money off of that tissue. Even once you have some kind of discovery, especially if you're reporting that discovery in Nature, you're going to be making money off that tissue because you're going to get more grant funding because your research is very well regarded. So even if they're not directly selling the tissue immediately after abortion, it does become commodification of human body parts at some point down the chain. You're quite right.
And I understood what you said earlier. You said you have to get living cells. You can't get living cells of a dead body. You can't get. So my understanding is that there are these humanized mice too. There's like a subcutaneous. The organs are harvested from the babies, and then they are placed subcutaneously in the mice. And I just, and also the cells, you said that has to be left. So are we talking about vivisection here? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I would say that we're talking about vivisection. And there's a couple really good books. One I think is called Abortion Beyond Fetal Experimentation. And the other one is Vivisection or Science. It's by Pietro Croce. They document, and they're not as up to date as something you could find on the internet. I believe They were written in the 80s, late 80s or 90s. But they document, going back in the literature, how aborted fetal tissue was obtained. And they make it very clear that the babies weren't dead at the time that that tissue was obtained. And these, you can find quotes in scientific literature from the 1930s and the 1950s in particular that indicate that they're taking tissue out of live babies. And in fact, I had written down two very interesting quotations. One is from a 1976 report by a drug manufacturer, Battelle Columbus Laboratories. And they talked about amniocentesis, respiratory distress, treatments for respiratory distress syndrome, the rubella vaccine, and the RH vaccine, which I'm presuming they're referring to RhoGAM. And they said, quote, research on living human fetuses played a significant role in each, end quote. And so this is being acknowledged, very, very openly there in the mid-70s. And then there was another quote from a fetal tissue supplier. The gentleman being quoted was James Bardsley. And he said, quote, we have to process the tissue within minutes of the time of death, unquote. And that would seem to indicate that they're maybe at least killing the babies before they do the dissection. But most of the other literature says things like dissected immediately, tissue was fresh, was immediately transferred to a sterile towel and kept at 5 degrees Celsius. All these things indicate that actually they didn't really bother to euthanize the babies first before they started removing the tissue. And even if they did, they're killing the baby directly in order to remove the tissue because they need to get that within a few minutes of the time of death. And kidney tissue in particular, probably before the time of death, because once the heart stops beating, the kidney has actually started to sustain damage as an individual is dying. So there's just a lot of evidence that points to the fact that you can't say, you just can't, say that this came from a natural miscarriage, and you can't say that, well, at least, the baby had already passed or things like that.
And do they use, is there any drugs used? My understanding is that they can't, because it interferes with the cells or the organs or whatever that you're using. They can't have drugs in them. So there's no.
Yeah, there's different, and so Monica Seeley talks about this in the Catholic World Report articles that you posted. If they use a feticide, so if they use a chemical that's designed to kill the fetus during a prostaglandin abortion, that's going to affect the tissues that are obtained. And so in some instances, they do not use the feticides in order to have the tissue be as undamaged as possible. And if you're not using a feticide, then you're going to deliver a live fetus. And
so, yeah, we're talking about a live abortion, which is in violation of legislation, but they get around that, I think.
Well, they can get around it because, even if they use a feticide, sometimes prostaglandin abortion results in a live delivery accidentally. And so, if you talk about a prostaglandin abortion and you happen to have a live delivery, there's really, unless you have specifically documented, oh yeah, we didn't use a feticide or this, that, or the other, there's no way to sort of nail you for that. Because it's not necessarily indicative that you did the abortion on purpose to result in a live delivery. And the scientific literature is very quiet on the time of death of the babies that are used for aborted fetal tissue experimentation. If we were using a rat, it would say either that the rat was sacrificed, which is the euphemism for killed. The rat was sacrificed and then the liver was removed, or the liver was removed and then the rat was sacrificed. It'll say that when you're talking about animals, but the papers won't say that when you're talking about babies. They're just silent on when the baby has actually died.
Interesting. Is vivisection in violation of the law with respect to animals?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I'm pretty sure that the law indicates that, because there was a lot of animal activists, and they restricted the use of animals and vivisection in medical schools, for example. And, there was a lot of rights attributed to animals. It seems to me that the fetus has less rights than an animal.
You're quite right.
And
An unborn baby has fewer rights than a lot of different kinds of animals.
Or you and I dead, we have more rights than dead than a fetus has. And the activism with respect to animal rights, do you think that played a role in shifting labs towards using fetal cells or fetal organs?
Not necessarily. I think that some things just don't work well in animal cells. They work better in human cells. So for example, the HIV project that I was working on, you cannot make HIV antigens in any kind of cell other than human cells. I think chickenpox as well, you can't grow the chickenpox virus in non-human cells. And the flu virus you can grow in chicken eggs, and that works just fine. But some viruses just don't, they won't function properly unless they're in human tissue, whether that's a human cell line or the human body when you get infected naturally. So it was not necessarily just animal rights activism. I think that interestingly, so tying my two areas of expertise together, I think that an evolutionary understanding of the human person actually drove abortion being acceptable, the intellectual justification for it, and it also drove then, I think, the devaluation of the human person, particularly in the use of aborted fetal tissue. Because if you go back to kind of early discussions of evolution theory, one of the things that was supposedly the best evidence that we had were these drawings that were done by a German embryologist. And he tried to show that at the beginning, the human embryo looks just like the fish embryo, which looks just like the salamander embryo, which looks just like a chicken embryo, which looks just like pig embryo. And so there was this idea that was very prevalent at the time, and still kind of shows up in science textbooks even today, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And so the idea was that as you developed in the womb, the ontogeny, that was, you were going through your evolutionary history, which is the phylogeny. So people actually put forward the idea that and this is where the whole "it's just a clump of cells" came from. So it's not a human yet because the baby is going through the fish stage in utero, or the amphibian stage, or the reptile stage, or whatever stage before it's human. And so if we're doing an abortion before it's human, it's not a big deal because it's not human yet. Then we are in our modern times, we just say, oh, well, it's just a clump of cells. But that's where that idea originally came from. The original intellectual justification was it's not human yet because it's going through its evolutionary history in utero. So there's a really strong connection here, I think, that the people miss sometimes between evolutionary biology and the culture of death.
Yes, and I really appreciate you bringing that out. That is something that has occurred to me, that allopathic medicine has shifted so that the basis of it is like an evolutionary, worldview. I'm curious to know if the use of fetuses in research and development in medicine and healthcare you think it's ubiquitous? Like, is it something that's...
No, I don't think it's ubiquitous. And I think there's been some unfortunate articles, and one of them was even unfortunately published by a Catholic priest, that have tried to claim that, all of these things are tested or developed in aborted fetal cells that weren't actually developed in aborted fetal cells. And, ivermectin was one, hydroxychloroquine, aspirin, Tylenol, ibuprofen. He's listing all these common medications and saying, oh, well, I found a paper that has aspirin and HEK293 in it. And so therefore, these are abortion tainted. And so everything is abortion tainted. So if you're going to use any medication, it's abortion tainted. And that's not making proper distinctions. So, St. Thomas Aquinas is sort of, rarely affirm, never deny, always distinguish. you always have to make the proper distinctions. So in the case of the COVID vaccines, it's very, very, very clear that all the vaccines that are available in the US, those vaccine manufacturers actively took and used aborted fetal cells in the development of their vaccines. So they had, their first step was to determine if the mRNA that they decided to use would make a spike protein that has the correct conformation. Because if you put the if you take the spike protein off of the coronavirus, it's kind of floppy. It's got a wishy-washy three-dimensional structure that doesn't actually mimic what it looks like when it's on the virus. And so they had to mutate the spike protein DNA, or in this case mRNA, to make sure that it would actually have the correct three-dimensional conformation. And then they had to actually put that into a cell, have the cell make these proteins, and see if, when they purified them, if it had the correct shape. And that was sort of the first part of vaccine development. And so for the Pfizer vaccine, they used HEK293 cells, and the Moderna vaccine, they used HEK293 cells for this particular test. And then once they knew that worked, then they had to say, okay, well, is the mRNA going to get taken up by the cells? They tested that in aborted fetal cells. Well, now we're going to package the mRNA in the lipid nanoparticles. Is that going to get taken up by cells? And the Moderna tested that in aborted fetal cells. And then once they started vaccinating people with the mRNA vaccines, they said, well, are these people producing antibodies? Well, to see if they're producing antibodies, let's make some pseudo-viruses, these viruses that won't infect people. And they made those in aborted fetal cells. So they're using aborted fetal cells at 3 to 4 different steps along the way for both Pfizer and Moderna. This is direct involvement. They're choosing to use these. This makes these drugs unethical. Now, the ivermectin was developed in the 1950s, before aborted fetal cell lines existed, specifically before HEK293 existed, because the abortion didn't happen until 1973, if I remember correctly. And there's no possible way that this drug could have been developed in HEK293. And so if someone is trying to claim that this drug is tainted because the people who developed it produced it in HEK293, they're telling a falsehood. And you might be able to find a paper that has ivermectin in HEK293 because someone down the line later, they're testing some other drug or some other condition or something, and they say, hey, ivermectin would be a good control to compare our drug against, or ivermectin is going to show us something that's going to be useful to something else for studying. They're not producing or developing ivermectin. This is sort of like saying, sorry, I get very frustrated.
You're being very clear. No, you're being very articulate.
God bless.
It's very clear what you mean. Yes.
Good. I'm glad it's clear, because sometimes people get a little confused because I'm using drug development terminology, and it's not quite as straightforward. But I always use the analogy of, if you had a gun manufacturer A, and they test their guns out to make sure they work by shooting babies with them, that's obviously immoral, right? That's what the Pfizer and the Moderna and the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson and the Novavax vaccine manufacturers are doing. They're doing what company A is doing. Now, company B produces perfectly ethical guns, but company A decides they're gonna buy some company B guns, and they're gonna test their guns against company B's guns, and now they're shooting babies with company B's guns. Company B is not liable for that. And those guns are still perfectly ethical to use.
Thank you.
You just can't, you can't take these tests that were done after these drugs were developed and marketed, and totally completely after the fact, for some other reason and some other purpose, and say, now this drug is tainted. Because if you do that, you can't drink water, because every aborted fetal cell is cultured in a water-based medium. So you have to be very careful about intentionality. Right. And I don't know what y'all's conception of culpability for sin and all of that is, but in the Catholic Church, we have the understanding, if you have no intention, no consent, there is no sin. I did not intend to do something wrong. I did not consent to doing something wrong. Therefore, I did not sin. So this applies especially when, men are confronted with these, nearly pornographic billboards as they're driving down the road. They did not intend to see a half-naked woman. They did not consent to seeing a half-naked woman because they looked away. They have not sinned, even though they have looked at a half-naked woman. And the same thing kind of applies to these vaccine or to these products that were developed, there was no intention to use aborted fetal cells. There was no consent to use the aborted fetal cells by the manufacturer. There is no sin by the manufacturer. The product is not tainted. You can freely take ibuprofen, Tylenol, aspirin, albuterol, all of these things that were listed in this article, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and not be involved with aborted fetal cell research. Now, there are some other drugs that have used aborted fetal tissue in their development. It's actually really, really, really hard to track this information down. I have had people, even internationally, email me and say, I don't want to use anything that's tainted by abortion. I use this specific prescription drug. Can you check it out for me? It takes me usually about an hour on average to figure out whether that drug had aborted fetal cells involved in its development or not. Sometimes I still can't actually tell. You actually have to track down the patent or the original paper that was published, showing its efficacy. So this is a tremendous undertaking to actually determine which drugs were developed using aborted fetal cells and which were not. And this is probably a good time to mention that the monoclonal antibodies that are being used for treatment for COVID, specifically Regeneron and Sotrovimab, which is GlaxoSmithKline's, if I'm saying that right, they were developed using aborted fetal cells. And Regeneron actually also used the humanized mice that we've been talking about.
Yeah, okay, that's the two questions that I had for you. You just took a breath. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So the two questions that I had, you sort of drilled down on the mRNA, and then you did mention the adenoviruses, which is the J&J or the Janssen and the AstraZeneca. I understand from the product monographs that they are actually in the vaccine. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah. So remember what I said earlier about if you're going to produce a virus, you need a cell to produce it, because you can't produce it by itself in the laboratory. It has to be produced in cell culture, because the cells are what make viruses. And so the cells that they're using to make the adenoviral vectors that become the vaccine for the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, those cells are aborted fetal cells. So AstraZeneca, I believe, used HEK293 and Johnson & Johnson used PERC6, but they're both aborted fetal cell lines. And so with both of those vaccines, you actually end up with aborted fetal contaminants in the vaccine. And this usually comes in the form of small pieces of DNA and also proteins that come from the aborted fetal cells. And Dr. Teresa Deischer from Sound Choice Pharmaceuticals has done an absolutely fabulous job documenting the problems with aborted fetal DNA in vaccines. And she's got some really great talks on YouTube where she looks at the connection between autism and aborted fetal contaminants in vaccines. And she shows, I think pretty conclusively, that every single time there was the introduction of a new aborted fetal vaccine on the US vaccine schedule, there was a rise in the increase of autism. And if you introduced 2 vaccines, there was double the rise. And 3 vaccines, it was triple the rise. So there's a dose-dependent response there too. And she explains kind of the biological mechanism for why that might be happening. But her work is just absolutely amazing and astounding. And also it makes perfect sense, because obviously this is an immoral thing to do. We would expect there to be some kind of natural law consequence. We would expect that if we're using aborted fetal tissue to make some kind of medical product, that it would have a bad side effect just on a natural level, because it's a horrific thing to do. So this is an additional problem with the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson. And it makes some people say, oh, well, they're immoral, but the Pfizer and the Moderna are not. But the Pfizer and Moderna, because they're using aborted fetal cells and testing over and over and over again, or even if they only used them once, they're still making use of this aborted fetal tissue. It's still unethical. It's still immoral. It's not really removing us from that problem just because we're not actually getting these pieces of aborted fetal DNA injected into our bodies. It just sounds a little less grotesque, but they're making use of the exact same tissues in order to develop these vaccines.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate that. I just want to say, wow. And I'm trying to take notes here. And really,
fortunately, recordings.
Yeah, we're recording. Yes, that's very true. Do you think, okay, so that was very helpful for you to distinguish and differentiate. There are some vaccines that don't depend on the fetal cell lines, but there are many vaccines that can't grow that you can't grow them in an animal serum. You have to have like a human, and they typically use the fetal cell lines. What about the humanized mice? Do you think, like, where are the humanized mice with respect to development and research in the medical field?
See, I'm just not as familiar with that. I can't kind of give you a comprehensive overview on that. I've kind of exhausted most of my knowledge of humanized mice in the course of this conversation, honestly.
They're for sale everywhere online, though. You can get, you know.
Yeah, it's just not something that I've specifically looked into, because because you can only hold so many things in your brain at one time. I feel like that just with the aborted fetal cell lines, it's sufficiently unethical to use any of these products that, that's kind of what I've been focusing on. But I definitely see that the humanized mice is a huge problem, and it ties into the vaccines because the vaccines are always used as justification for doing additional research with aborted fetal tissue. And the humanized mice is one of the most grotesque uses of aborted fetal tissue that I can imagine, where you're actually, you do require fresh inputs of tissue anytime you do an experiment. And also you're now making a chimera, a human mouse chimera. And there's really something wrong with that. There's something wrong with putting human tissue into a brute animal.
I thank you so kindly. I am going to hand back the questioning to Natalie Furman, but before I do, I just wanted to put some quotes. There's some quotes that I wanted to go through from the book, The Fetal Donor, and the author was Peter McCullough, not the Peter McCullough that we know today that's speaking all over on the COVID vaccines. And one of the things that he had said in the book was not just the questioning, but the ethics of using the fetuses in embryonic research, but the ethics with respect to how it changes like the worldview or the mind, the frame of mind of these professionals in the labs that are using it. And one of the examples that he gave was that they take off the heads of the fetuses and measure the brain activity till it's gone. And it's just shocking to me, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to share. I don't know what you can see.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Can you see a Word document?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I do quote Dr. Teresa Dacer, and I'm trying to find sorry, pardon me. I thought I had it lined up. So in the book, The Fetus as Transplant Donor, Scientific, Social, and Ethics Perspectives by Peter McCullough, and it was printed in 1987, he states, in each instance, the embryo or fetus was obtained at the time of hysterectomy, the heart exposed, and the perfusion began immediately. What's perfusion?
That's a good question. I will
have an answer for us.
Up really quick.
Quickly,
I'm a molecular biologist. So,
okay.
So perfusion it refers to the delivery of blood to a specific area, the passage of fluid through the circulatory system.
You're taking blood from
it sounds like they were because I think I've heard of this before. They actually would inject chemicals into the babies and see how that affected their heart until they died. And so that may be what they're talking about, but I'd have to see the context of that specific quote to be completely sure. But it does have to do with like flowing of things through the circulatory vessels.
A human fetal, thank you. Thank you very much. That was helpful. 8 human fetal heads obtained by abdominal hysterectomy at 12 to 17 weeks gestation were perfused through the internal carotid arteries. Healthy human fetuses aged 7 to 21 weeks from legal abortions were used. The conceptual age was estimated from crown rump lengths and body weight. Fetal liver and kidney were rapidly removed and weighed. This is all from his research. And the truth here, the truth about fetal research every month there's research that's done that it's a huge commodification. It sounds like it happens on a large scale at the very least. Would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, actually, the article you're quoting there with Lishan Su, I've run across that before, and it was one of the things that kind of clued me into this. I don't know the extent to which this is done, but I suspect it's much bigger than any of us have a conception of at this moment. Because this is, that article's from 2015, is that right?
Pardon me,
we were just looking at.
Yes, December 9th.
Yeah, that's 7 years ago, and nobody, which of us knew 7 years ago that this was even a thing?
Right. No, we didn't.
Nobody sitting here knew 7 years ago that they were doing things like this with babies. I think that one of the blessings of the whole COVID-19 situation is this has blown the lid off of the aborted fetal research industry. And it cannot any longer continue in complete darkness.
We'll never put the horse back in the barn, right? So Priscilla Alderson, she wrote a review of the fetus's transplant donor in the British Medical Journal, and she makes it clear that tissues and organs of unborn fetuses are harvested while their heart is still beating. She says, and it was only like a few paragraphs, that's why there's not a page number or anything here. She says transplant material is likely to be taken from fetuses aged 12 to 18 weeks gestation. There is a detailed section on the status of the fetus at this stage, on its aliveness, which is very different from its viability, and on research showing well-developed physical and neurological responses to pain in fetuses of 10 weeks gestation. Physical tissue for transplantation must be harvested within a few minutes of delivery. Ideally, this is by hysterectomy with the fetus delivered in utero. Drugs which reduce fetal physiological activity need to be avoided. The fetus is therefore in as alive and aware as state as possible when being opened. It's just brutal. It's just, is it okay if I stop sharing this? Is there anything else?
I think you've you've definitely brought up the pertinent information. This is not the first place I've seen this basically said in so many words. There are multiple sources that I've cited myself, that Children of God for Life have cited, that all indicate that, really, in order for this to work, the baby has to be alive when you're dissecting it, and
no drug, or as little as possible.
No anesthetic, no, because if you do affect the tissues, and it's beyond horrific. It's honestly, this is modern human sacrifice. It's not an Aztec priest standing on the top of a temple with an obsidian knife, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah, it's heartless. It's heartless, and I'm just grateful for you to highlight this, and grateful for your expertise, and to speak to us and the people who will be viewing this, because I think that it's a deception that needs to be revealed, and it's something that I didn't know about until just this fall myself. As I was sort of drilling down on the whole religious objection to the COVID vaccines. And of course, there's a mockery almost, there's no religious objection. It's like mocked. And I just think that this is one of the most brutal things I've ever come across with respect to that research. And I'll stop sharing the screen there. And may I just, before I pass you back to Natalie Furman. Natalie, did I miss anything? Can you just direct me if we talked about something else that I was going to raise?
No, I think, I have one question with regards to this topic. Then we're going to switch gears a little bit. My question to this topic is, how many medical professionals know about this? Who in the medical community knows about this?
I mean, honestly, I think very few people, relatively speaking, more now than used to. But, you know, if you were a Catholic mom and you went into the doctor's office in the late 1990s and said, I really don't want my child to have a chickenpox vaccine because of the aborted fetal cells, they would have been like, what are you talking about? You know, and granted, that was 20 years ago, but, you know, there's a lot of medical professionals that just aren't, they're really not educated about vaccines at all, let alone ethical considerations involving vaccines, let alone safety considerations involving vaccines. I mean, most medical professionals will tell you their entire education with respect to vaccines consisted in, here's how to deal with vaccine hesitant parents, here's the CDC schedule, moving on. And that's not their fault. You know, you're covering so much in medical school that to do a deep dive into vaccination is just really not even possible for most doctors. And you know, if you're drilled with this is safe and effective, this is safe and effective, this is safe and effective, this is necessary, this is safe and effective, you know, you don't ever, a lot of people don't ever question that. I didn't ever question that. You know, I never questioned the safe and effective, we need vaccines or we're all going to die kind of narrative, you know, until I started doing my research for the book that I wrote. And I realized that there's a lot of this stuff is based on outdated science from the 1800s, and you know, that hasn't been properly verified, or it was done in situations that were unique to specific pathogens that really aren't relevant to the pathogens that we vaccinate for now. And then, you know, all the injuries and all the adjuvants and all the rise in the autism and the ADHD and the autoimmune diseases, and you know, it's all connected. I just opened a whole can of worms, didn't I?
Okay. I have a question from our viewers. Somebody asked, how do they select the abortion? Are the mothers and babies pre-selected?
So generally speaking, the mother has to give her consent for her baby to be used for medical purposes. Usually it's not described to her exactly how that's going to happen, but some sort of consent form has to be signed. And then once that consent form is signed, they you know, they choose, generally speaking, fetuses of particular age. So that might then involve scheduling abortions at a particular time in order to obtain that particular age of fetus. But you know, they're and it's not like down to the day or anything. Usually it's a particular week or a range of weeks. But yeah, they definitely have to choose a specific age in order to have viable tissue. So the tissue has to be sufficiently differentiated that you can get a kidney or get, you know, retinal tissue out of the baby that's being aborted. But not, usually not so old that it's kind of obvious to everyone involved that, you know, hey, this is a baby that could survive outside the womb, for legal reasons.
Yes, I had been doing some reading. I found out a couple of things. Number one, my impression is that the abortion industry, especially after the Planned Parenthood videos were released to the public, is far more regulated and scrutinized now. And so tissue is perhaps procured from overseas, China being a prime area, and maybe African countries as well. So
well, and Sweden too, because the Karolinska Institute.
Oh yes, yes. There have been some dark scientific things that have come out of that Karolinska Institute. Anyway, okay, before I switch gears, Grace, is there anything else, or viewers, are there any other questions that we need to bring up?
My head is spinning, and I just really appreciate everything. So I may come back with a question after, but I appreciate that. I'm reading, Natalie, in front of me, your question number 5, and I'm really looking forward to the answers.
Okay. A final question is the mother selling the baby for research?
I don't think so. That's not something I've run across in my research, but I don't have, you know, confirmation one way or the other for that. Generally, the justification is always, well, the abortion was going to happen anyway. So it's an elective abortion. It's an abortion that the mother chose for psychiatric reasons or medical reasons or whatever the reasons, or in some cases, married couple, perfectly normal, healthy baby, but just felt like they had too many children right now kind of thing. So I don't think that the mother is involved in selling the baby. I would say I've not seen this at all, any confirmation of this. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because I've just never seen any confirmation of that in any way. So I don't think that's involved.
Okay, let's see. First of all, we are officially out of time. So we have a whole other half of a presentation to get to right now. But I have a question for you. I want to respect everyone's schedule. Pamela, would it be of interest to you to record part 2 of this? Just perhaps say you, Grace and myself, and our tech person at another time. Would that be of interest to you? I know that you're in very high demand.
I am, but I'm always happy to do things like this. So I would definitely be willing to at least discuss, another part 2 at some date that is amenable to everyone involved. Okay.
So let me share with our viewers what part 2 is going to involve, because this has been a very, very important discussion for our community. With regards to the fetal research, we have had medical, our physicians in our Adventist medical community have shared with us that it is okay to take this vaccine. It's recommended to take this vaccine, and we are harming the public health if we do not take this vaccine. And number one, we have seen here that there is incredible harm to live babies that are being born, and donating isn't even the word. Their bodies are being stripped of tissue without anesthesia to save, quote, our lives. That is a problem. And I agree with you. It's not like we're all at an altar with the Aztec priest who's about to cut the heart out of the sacrifice, but we are at the surgeon's table where he's about to cut the organs out of fetuses. And I think of that scripture verse in the New Testament that if any of these little ones are harmed, it would be better for you for a millstone to be hung around your neck and for you to be drowned in the depths of the ocean. Yeah. I think there is not enough outrage over this topic. So number one, I think I'm just going to go back to what I shared here. Which is these commandments. Let's see here. Biblical principles for considering a vaccine or not. Number one, thou shalt not kill. God knew this thousands of years ago. We shouldn't kill. So that's Exodus 20:13. Number two, thou shalt not mix kind with diverse kind. Leviticus 19:19. First, there are strange animals that are being used. And thirdly, they are unclean animals from Leviticus 11:14. And I'm going to stop right there because I'm going to get back to the next part of the presentation, which is your book, part 2. The next part that you discuss is very, very important to us. You discuss how using our non-self DNA is causing tremendous diseases in the human population at large. So when we take a fetus whose DNA is not our own and we inject that in our bodies via vaccine, that's called a DNA contaminant, and that is harming our health. It causes allergic reactions, it causes autoimmune disorders. Then you're going to talk about how effective vaccines are. What is this notion of viral shedding? What is the notion of temporary immunity? Everybody thinks vaccines last forever, but in fact, your research shows something different. You discuss overcommitting systems, the immune system, to a particular set of to memory. So basically, our immune system has a cell memory capacity, kind of like our iPhones. So if we use up all of our memory in our iPhones, there is no more. That's the same thing that's happening with the human body. And I think you discussed the COVID along with that a little bit. You talk about damage to the microbiomes. You talk about toxic chemicals that are being used, the rate of vaccine failure, which is also a big discussion today with the boosters, et cetera, and the COVID vaccine. You talk about viral resistance. And finally, you talk about death. So, so that's going to be in part 2. Let me see what else I am going to highlight here of the questions. You're going to talk about how vaccines originated really in the public sector, how this thing came about. And I'm so glad you mentioned that we are all operating on 100-year-old medicine with vaccines today.
Yep. Yeah. More than more
yes.
than close to 170-year-old in some cases.
Wow. Okay.
Mm.
And then finally, you're going to talk about something that is very profound to Adventists, because we have embedded into our religion, we have something called the health message. And I found it very interesting to read your book. I'm going to feature that a little bit right here because that was very profound. Let's see. Oh, dear. Okay. Can everybody see this? These two paradigms. I think I have something in the way here. So let me click out of that. Okay, you have the evolutionary science paradigm, which is everything I just discussed. And then you have this creation providence paradigm. So yeah, I guess that will be in part 2 as well. So again, I'd like to invite everybody back for that. I think that is about it for this discussion. Let me just review my notes really quickly. I guess I'd like to say, Pamela, we are so thankful for your stand to your conviction. We are thankful to your principled commitment to truth. We are thankful for your information that you've shared today. And we ask God's continued blessing on your life and work. And I think we'd like to say thank you, and I recognize that we need to let you go.
Well, thank you. Thank you for, thank you for your stand on this issue, because it's important that, that we all get on the same page about the ethical questions and the pro-life issues, and we take a stand, because if we don't, we're going to lose our ability to do that. And so I really appreciate what you guys are doing here, trying to bring this information out in your own faith community and really help people to take that stand. So
thank you so much. With that, Pamela, we will let you go. We'll schedule another time to finish part 2. Everyone will release that on the site, along with part 2 of Ron Panzer's bioethic discussion. So please stay tuned for that, and we will let you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone else, please stay tuned. Let's see. I think if you would bow your heads with me in prayer, we will conclude this meeting. Okay, dear Heavenly Father, you have shown us what is good and what you have required of us, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly in thy path. Please help us to do that. Lord, it may be a cost to each of us to obey you, but we know that you have paid the ultimate cost, Lord, with your own life, and help us to walk in your footsteps. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again, Grace.
Thank you. Amen. That was a beautiful prayer. And thank you to everybody, Joy and Pamela, Natalie, you were just integral to pulling this all together.